Hello, thank you for that. Okay, good morning. Unlike many of you, I am not an MD, I am not a PhD, and I did not start my career in a lab. Actually, until 2015, I had never worked in science. But for the last decade, I've co-founded and built one of the more successful companies in microbiome science. And this field has fundamentally changed how I see health, how I see our bodies, and even for me, what it means to be human. When I was in high school, my mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and 361 days later, she died. This is when I started reading scientific papers and learning about clinical trials and beginning to understand how science makes its way to human impact. What I remember most at the time was this feeling that we were only seeing such a small part of the picture. My mom spent most of her 361 days in denial, so sure that she would beat it, seeing every doctor, surgeon, healer, and really anybody who said that they could help. But what stuck with me the most from this time and what inspired a really lifelong journey of understanding was that something foundational was missing. While I did not pursue medicine or science, my sister became a radiation oncologist. I've spent most of my professional life in media and design and technology, but it was this persistent feeling of this missing piece that brought me later to the microbiome. To take a step back, since my mom passing in high school, we've witnessed some extraordinary scientific advancements that impacted my journey and enabled the field of microbiome to progress. We sequenced the human genome. We developed new sequencing technologies that allowed us to see the microbial world in a resolution that we never could before. And in the early 2000s, a series of discoveries began shifting our understanding of human health, not just through our genes, but through the trillions of microbes that live in and on us. And by 2015, these advancements collided with my life in three important ways. First, I became pregnant with my first son. I met my co-founder, Raja Dheer, who is an extraordinary researcher who had been inspired by the microbiome since two groundbreaking mouse studies in 2006. One that revealed how gut microbes influence metabolism and obesity, and two, another that showed how microbes shape immune system development in the early windows of life. The third important way for me was that I began to fully appreciate the emerging field of the microbiome, not just as a scientific revolution, but as something very deeply personal, because I was pregnant at the time and beginning to understand how the microbiome shapes our health trajectory from birth onwards, but also existential because it challenged so many of the biological truths that I had taken for granted. For those of you who've seen the Matrix, this was kind of my red pill moment. Because once you understand the microbiome and its role in our biology, you really can't unsee it. When Raj and I came from very different worlds, we saw something very similar, that it was a field with extraordinary potential, but there was a massive gap between the research and the real human impact. And in some ways actually worse, because it was a field that was being commercialized and popularized in ways that actually threatened its credibility. For the first time, a frontier field of science had mass consumer awareness, which led to opportunism and misinformation and a rush to commercialize microbiome products without really the necessary research. Suddenly, gut health was dominating the algorithms of social media, and consumer health categories like probiotics were in literally everything. Skincare products, tortilla chips, and even pillowcases. People knew the microbiome was important, but the evangelism was really way outpacing the evidence. The hype was drowning out the breakthroughs, and instead of building credibility, it actually created an incredible amount of skepticism and resistance, especially within the clinical and scientific communities. So we founded Seed Health, which was really to advance frontier science and bridge this gap between these breakthroughs that were happening in science and real-world application. And since then, I've gotten the chance to work with some of the most renowned scientists and researchers leading the field of microbiome and accomplish many firsts in the field. But we also began with a very core belief that has guided our work from day one, which is that science isn't finished until it is communicated. Because the microbiome is one of the most promising frontiers, it's also one of the most misrepresented. So while we've had many accomplishments I'm very proud of, some of the most meaningful have actually come from how we tell this story. It's why we've won awards not just for our science, but actually for how our science is communicated. Because the way that we collectively tell stories in these new fields of science actually can deeply impact their future. So let me begin by grounding us in some definitions. The NIH definition of the microbiome reads, the microbiome is the full collection of microbes, their genetic material, and their functional potential in a given environment. For centuries, we've defined health through our organs, our tissues, our genes, but as we learned from the microbiome, that's really only half the story. In fact, we're only 50% human, our other half microbial. For every human cell in our bodies, there is a microbial counterpart, 38 trillion of them. We are, by definition, ecosystems, much like a coral reef or a rainforest, or really planets unto ourselves. And while most associate the microbiome with gut health, its influence really does extend so far beyond digestion. It's involved in nearly every organ system and biological function of our bodies, influencing major aspects of our health, metabolism, immunity, brain and cognitive function, inflammation, cellular health, reproductive hormonal health, skin, cardiovascular health, and even how we age. Your microbiome expresses 100 times more genes than your genome, and it contributes to over 1/3 of the metabolites in our blood. From our gut to our skin, our mouth to our lungs, our underarms to our noses, and even our belly buttons, what we've come to learn is that our microbiome is like an interface between our bodies and the world around us. There really is no version of human health that exists without our microbiome. Now, this is a fundamental change in our framework for health, as for most of history, bacteria were really seen as threats. Germ theory certainly paved the way for some of the most important medical breakthroughs, like life-saving antiseptics, antibiotics, and of course vaccines. But it also had another side effect, which is that it ingrained in us a collective fear of microbes, specifically bacteria. And so over a century, we did everything we could to get rid of them. In waging war on microbes, we kind of inadvertently waged war on ourselves. Less than 1% of bacteria are actually harmful, and for many, as we have come to learn, are actually essential. But for decades, the idea that bacteria could play a positive role in human health was actually dismissed. Then came C. difficile, a hospital-acquired infection that antibiotics could not stop. Patients were suffering from relentless recurring infections, and for many it was very fatal. Doctors were stuck in antibiotic cycles, wiping out the gut microbiome and making patients even more vulnerable to reinfection, until one researcher did something very radical. Instead of trying to kill the infection, they transplanted healthy bacteria from a donor into the infected patient, and the result was a 90% cure rate. A disease that antibiotics couldn't fix, solved by microbes. This wasn't really just about C. diff, though. It was really upending everything that we knew about microbes, disease, and medicine. If a single microbial intervention could cure an incurable infection, then what else were we missing? And every year since then, the science has progressed, uncovering new influences of the microbiome in areas that we hadn't even contemplated when we started SEED. In the mid-2000s, the microbiome field exploded. In 2006, researchers discovered a connection between the gut bacteria and obesity, showing that microbial imbalances could influence metabolism and body weight. In 2007, the Human Microbiome Project mapped thousands of bacterial species in the gut, confirming that diversity is actually essential for health. And over the next decade, the discoveries continued. 2017, scientists found that gut microbes could influence cancer treatment outcomes. Around the same time, gut-brain research gained traction, showing links between microbes and anxiety, depression, and cognitive function. And next-generation probiotics, strains like Akkermansia, were being investigated for their role in metabolism, obesity, and chronic inflammation. As of today, the field of microbiome now has its first approved therapeutics. In 2023, the FDA approved actually the first ever microbiome therapies for recurrent C. diff infections. Clinical trials are now paving the way for microbiome-based treatments for everything from inflammatory diseases to autoimmune conditions to autism. Scientists are investigating how to prime the prenatal period, the fetal microbiome, optimizing microbial inheritance, so for lifelong immunity and metabolic resilience. Advancements in AI and some of the larger scale microbiome data sets are now enabling scientists to model these microbial patterns across lifespans unlocking predictive models for health and disease. And researchers are even exploring how we might reverse engineer the microbiome of centenarians, identifying the key microbial strains that are linked to longevity and health span. We are really no longer studying the microbiome, we are now harnessing its potential. And until recently, we've thought about many aspects of our health as fixed or determined by genetics, something we inherit rather than something we can influence. But the microbiome changes that. Unlike our genes, over 90% of the microbiome is shaped by external factors like diet, environment, and lifestyle. This makes it really one of the most powerful levers of health. And this realization is very urgent, because despite the rise in health tracking and precision medicine and biohacking and the $6 trillion we spend in wellness, we've actually never been sicker. Our modern lifestyle and our built environment, including antibiotic overuse and processed diets and chronic stress, are really disrupting the healthy function of our microbiomes at scale. And we're seeing the correlations. A surge in inflammatory and metabolic diseases like GI disorders, obesity, and autoimmune conditions, a rise in immune dysfunction linked to everything from allergies to increased vulnerability in infections, and an epidemic of chronic inflammation affecting not just our physical health, but our mood and our cognition and our long-term resilience. I think of this as the climate change of our health, but the microbiome isn't really just a casualty of modern life, it is the key to thriving within it. As we deepen our understanding of the microbiome, we're really learning how that can form a much more predictive and preventive and proactive future of health. It's changing how we care for our bodies and how we live, what we eat, how we nourish our microbes and ourselves, how we sleep, how the microbiome influences our circadian rhythm and our sleep and wake cycles, how we manage stress, and in turn, how stress impacts our microbiome, how and when we use antibiotics, what probiotics, prebiotics, and other supplementation we should take, not just if, but which ones and why, what products we use, from the skincare products we put on our face to the toothpaste we choose and whether or not we should use mouthwash, how we clean ourselves and our homes, what we use for our dishes and our surfaces, how and when we wash our children or don't, which clothing materials we wear, how we approach birth and early life, from the role of microbes in pregnancy to whether or not we breastfeed and for how long, when and how often we may spend time in nature and outside, and even whether or not we have a dog, because pets can enrich our microbial diversity and turn our immunity. But the shift is also not just happening in human health. We're also studying our environmental microbiomes and starting to understand how we can harness microbes for caring for our planet, for the regeneration of soil, for the restoration of coral reefs, and even for capturing CO2. The microbiome forces us to move, I think, beyond a reductionist view of health. Instead of isolated inputs and outcomes, it really offers us the opportunity to think in systems and interdependencies. The microbiome is really not just a frontier field of science, it is a deep reminder that the truths that we've long held and what we ingrain in us to fear can actually sometimes have the greatest potential for solutions and innovations that could change our trajectory and inform our future. I think perhaps it also most urgently reminds us that everything really is in fact connected. Thank you.
Probably some of the best slides I've ever seen.
Oh,
amazing.
Thank you.
Tell me, you mentioned that Seed Health has developed a couple of products already. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. I think probably maybe the one I'm the most proud of is we developed, actually started as a drug. We worked, Dr. Jacques Ravel, who's really one of the originating scientists, wrote the first NIH grant for the vaginal to understand and characterize the vaginal microbiome. We developed from about 15 to 20 years of his work. He has the largest strain bank in vaginal microbiome as well as gene catalog. And so we worked with him over the course of 7 years to translate his 15 years of work into the first vaginal symbiotic, 3 strains of Lactobacillus crispatus combined with specific prebiotics in a vaginal tablet to optimize the vaginal microbiome and induce what is called a CST1, which is a community state type of vaginal microbiome that we know from many years of research to be the most protective and resilient. So it's really taking a very different approach. Most women in health experience, who experience infection and recurrence, or for areas where there are kind of unmet needs, are usually antimicrobial or antifungal solutions. And so this is quite different, this is very similar to the C. diff story. This is actually implanting the optimal vaginal microbiome for a long-term resilience and sustainability against, infection, but also for optimization for reproductive outcomes, gynecological outcomes, urogenital outcomes. And that's one that I'm very, very proud of. It's available in the US today. It's called VSO1. It's a vaginal symbiotic. And that's certainly one that we launched it publicly last May.
Last May. And when do you expect to be available here?
When your regulation changes.
Okay. Any politicians here?
We have a lot of people from the UK who ask their friends to bring it to them here actually now. Yeah.
And you mentioned some of the clinical trials ongoing. Not specifically just Seed Health, but
I would say
what are the most promising ones?
Well, we just finished. We're the first to be able to demonstrate the first of all, deeply characterize the impact of broad-spectrum antibiotics on the gut microbiome, and then demonstrate how our leading product, which is actually the #1 symbiotic or probiotic in the US today, how it can restore gut barrier and immune function and gut function, and preserve diversity after concurrent and after broad-spectrum antibiotics. And we just published that study.
Okay. And so, apart from getting a dog, which I think everyone should do, what else would you advise, our audience, if they can take 3 things to improve their microbiome-friendly life, what would you suggest?
I think one of the greatest levers in microbiome, what's been the most characterized, is diet. And there's pretty much indisputable evidence that a plant-led diet and diversity of plants based foods is equal to diversity of microbiome. The American Gut Project, which came out of UCSD, which was one of the larger citizen science initiatives in gut microbiome research, discovered that their guidance would say 30 different types of plants every week equals the most diversity in the gut microbiome. And we see that kind of replicated in the research. We're getting to a place now where it's really exciting, where you can say this very specific prebiotic or this very specific compound from a blackberry enriches this specific strain in the gut microbiome, but at a very high level, eat plants, eat a lot of them, and eat diversity. Actually, interestingly, because I think a lot of people who are even very healthy tend to eat a lot of the same things, and I think so it's very interesting, the diversity of plant-based foods is definitely a guidance.
Just one last question about something it's hard to avoid, which is the environmental toxins you mentioned. How do we go about, if people live in cities, obviously, it's hard to avoid what is around us in that sense. What can we do to mitigate the effects of...
How many hours do you have?
Okay, we have 1 minute.
I think I think there are choices I think there's micro choices we make every single day that impact the way that we allow our environment to impact us. How often we stay indoors. They've studied even the temperature of lights and how that impacts your skin microbiome, how that impacts your gut microbiome. So there's so many, there's absolutely, of course, the diet piece is huge. Because I think so much it's not about control. You can control your environment to a certain extent, but if you're going to live in a city, you're going to live in an urban environment, you're going to participate in modern life and not move to a cabin in the middle of Norway and never talk to anybody.
Too cold.
Then it really is about thinking about your microbiome as we always say, help them help you. So thinking about the resilience, it's not so much about never getting sick or never being impacted, but it's about resilience, and that's kind of the way that we define health. So everything from understanding the compounds that we clean with, that we put on our skin, that we put on our bodies, and when you understand how they interact with really our immune system and these barriers of our body, you start to think a little bit about the choices that that you make.
Shouldn't clean too much, right?
Yeah, and so I think so much of it is lifestyle. Exercise, all the things that even for your human biology, are very important. We just now know from microbiome, like we can characterize the impact of just living in a city, for example, on our skin or what it does to our gut. So,
brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank
and
you.
You're on Test Lab as well, right?
And what?
You're on Test Lab, so you guys are exhibiting some of your products upstairs on our exhibition space.
I don't. If
I think
that
you
may
are.
be
Anyway,
true.
thank you so much.
Now I know. Thank you.